Picture the American West in the 1800s. Tumbleweeds, outlaws, and, oddly enough, an incredible amount of coughing. While history books love to focus on the high noon standoffs and gold rushes, they tend to skip over the frigid, bone-shivering reality of frontier nights. Yes, beneath all those dusty sunsets and tumbleweeds were people attempting to survive winter with nothing but determination. Woolen socks, probably knitted with mixed hope and regret, and a stove that failed more often than it worked. Evenings fell fast out there. 1 minute, you're watching the sky blush with sherbet streaks, and the next minute, you're huddled in a sod house with frost forming on your moustache, whether you meant to grow one or not. The settlers didn't exactly have central heating or electric blankets. No thermostats. No microwave tea to clutch between shivering hands. Just spirit, stubbornness, and layering strategies that involved everything from buffalo hides to someone else's old curtains. Take the sod house, for example, affectionately dubbed soddies. Built from bricks of earth and grass, they were nature's early attempt at affordable housing. Cozy wasn't the first word most people used to describe these dwellings, unless your idea of cozy includes dirt falling steadily from the ceiling and the occasional snake poking its head in for a visit. Really, who needs a chimney when the entire roof lets smoke out and occasionally stars in? Inside the sod house wasn't exactly warm, but it tried really hard. The stove, often the proudest possession of any settler family, would roar to life during the evening with the help of buffalo chips. For the uninitiated, and this may be exactly what sends you into dreams, a buffalo chip is dried buffalo dung, which, to the desperate, counted as fuel. You haven't lived until you've tried cooking biscuits over a dung fire while pretending you're on a grand, noble adventure. Some settlers even grew, nostalgic about the stuff. It burned slow, it burned hot, and well, it added a very unique aroma to mealtimes. One can only assume that barbecue sauce was invented out of sheer necessity. As for beds, feather mattresses were a laughable luxury. Most folks slept on straw mattresses stuffed into roughly built wooden frames, or more commonly, on hard, flattened piles of whatever wasn't smouldering in the stove. Blankets were often handmade, if not from wool, then from layers of patchworked fabric that often included old flour sacks, worn trousers, or the remnants of a pair of curtains that once witnessed a better life in Boston. Bundling became a nighttime ritual that bordered on spiritual ceremony. You'd wear everything you owned: long johns, wool shirts, flannel, more flannel, your great uncle's flannel, and maybe a raccoon hat if the raccoon left quietly. Families often shared beds, and not entirely out of fondness. Shared body heat was much more appealing when it was 15 degrees and your breath was freezing into a small, sad cloud above your head. Privacy was a summer luxury. In winter, everyone's toes knew too much about everyone else. But despite the discomfort, there was a kind of deep warmth in the stories settlers passed down around those stoves. Children cuddled against their parents, listening to tales of cities they'd never seen and trains they'd never ride. The walls might have been made of dirt, but hearts and tea stayed warm thanks to community and the occasional fiddle if someone had managed to hang on to one. Outside, the wind would moan across the prairie like a lonely cow looking for a blanket. Inside, someone stirred the porridge pot and added just the tiniest pinch of salt, as if seasoning could trick you into thinking oatmeal for dinner was a thrilling culinary adventure. It was bland, it was endless, and yet it filled the belly and calmed the spirit, because at the end of it all, survival wasn't flashy. It wasn't a shootout. or a dramatic gallop into the sunset. It was wrapping your feet in yesterday's newspaper, shifting closer to the stove, and being very, very grateful that tonight the roof hadn't collapsed. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, close your eyes gently, breathe a little deeper, and let the quiet rustle of prairie winds carry you forward. Let your eyelids grow heavy and your thoughts drift like snowflakes, because now we find ourselves in the twilight chill of an 1870s prairie evening. The sun, having finished its reluctant descent behind the frayed edge of the horizon, leaves behind a sky brushed in ash and lavender. The wind whispers secrets through the grass, and the logs of a sagging log cabin creak in protest, as though even they wish they were somewhere warmer. In this chapter of icy, innovation, and desperate determination, we step gently into the rustic living rooms of frontier folk, where warmth was less a guarantee and more of a hope. A polite suggestion, really. Now, if you thought the pioneers headed west with electric blankets and central heating packed between the dried beans and rifle cartridges, let me gently correct the record. Heating in the American West was a do-it-yourself activity. The kind of do-it-yourself that doubled as a maybe I can freeze slightly slower than yesterday experience. The primary weapon against winter's nip was the wood-burning stove, equal parts lifesaver, hunk of cast iron, and marital dispute starter. These stoves were often ornery contraptions that might either underheat a room or turn it into a Finnish sauna without warning. Homesteaders often bragged, or perhaps merely confessed, to sleeping with their feet like ice and their eyebrows lightly roasted. The stove sat like a deity in the center of the home, perpetually surrounded by offerings of dry kindling and loosely made promises to sweep the chimney next week. Smoke occasionally leaked out at polite intervals, scenting the room with eau de scorched pine. If the fire went out in the middle of the night, someone had to get up to restart it, a dreadful lottery that often involved passive-aggressive coughing until someone else caved. Now, if wood was scarce, which it almost always was, especially on the vast treeless plains, pioneers got creative. Welcome to the fragrant and frankly steamy topic of buffalo chips, not potato chips. No, these were the hardened, sun-baked droppings of America's roaming shaggy tanks, the bison. To the uninformed, the idea of stooping over the prairie to gather poo cookies might sound unthinkable. But to homesteaders, buffalo chips were brown gold, stacking easily and burning surprisingly clean once dry. Children were often tasked with chip collecting, which they may have resented at first, but eventually grew to appreciate. After all, you can't freeze to death holding a grudge when your pants are steaming, thanks to a fresh fire of excrement. Of course, not every settler had a buffalo handy. In wooded regions, firewood remained the preferred currency of warmth, though chopping it guaranteed one thing. You would stay temporarily warm while collecting it and permanently sore thereafter. If a tree dared to fall without being used, it was considered an act of nature most foul. And if firewood supply didn't meet demand, the furniture started to look suspiciously flammable. Many chairs of the Old West never made it past their first winter. Sacrifices were made. Rocking chairs perished. Some families heated their homes using corn cobs, which burned with the fragrant enthusiasm of a rural holiday candle. Not very hot, but deeply symbolic. Now, once the fire was going, whether fueled by logs, chips, or Grandma's rocking chair, it was vital to keep the heat from escaping. Windows were not so much panes of glass as wishful openings plugged with oiled paper or worn fabric. Drafts danced through cracks in the chinking between logs, so enterprising souls stuffed these gaps with anything at hand. Wool, newspapers, old letters, and if one got desperate, yesterday's socks. Many homes had more insulation made from garments than any formal material. It was an architecture of necessity, with a touch of accidental whimsy. At night, entire families often slept in the same room, huddled together for body heat, like a pile of tired sausages. A mother might tuck the children into bed with so many quilts that one child famously murmured, "Ma, I can't breathe, but I'm warm," which in those days was considered a win. And then, of course, there was the featherbed, not as glamorous as it sounds, less like sinking into luxury, more like being stuffed underneath 37 pounds of goose murder. But oh, it was warm. And in a world where the wind was an uninvited guest scratching at your door, warm was all that mattered. So the wind howled, the rafters groaned, and the settlers dreamed, beneath their quilt forts, behind buffalo chip fires, nestled into the fragile cocoon of human stubbornness. Because in the Wild West, surviving the cold wasn't just a skill, it was an art. Let the snow fall where it may, as we now peek into the lives of those who wore their survival on their sleeves. Layered, woolen, and occasionally full of hay. As the long shadow of twilight settled across the open prairie, a familiar hush descended upon the settler's homestead. A hush not of peace exactly, though it was quiet out there, but of a different kind of stillness. The kind that comes just before your teeth start clattering like castanets in a ghostly mariachi band. It was cold, the kind of cold that makes even the stars seem to huddle together for warmth. By November, the settlers of the American frontier had begun their annual battle against the elements, and to the surprise of no one, the elements were winning on points. You see, winter didn't just arrive in the Wild West. It ambushed you, like a poker cheat with a derringer tucked in his boot. The cabins themselves were, shall we say, optimistically described as shelter. Built from whatever the nearest axe could reach, most dwellings were made of logs roughly as uniform as a bundle of broomsticks. No insulation, no caulking. Just a prayer and a hope that the wind would get bored and bother someone else. When that northern wind howled through the cracks, which it gleefully did, families didn't reach for a thermostat because, well, they didn't exist. Instead, they did what any self-respecting squirrel does in bleak midwinter. They layered up. Wool, flannel, and anything that wasn't on fire became insulation. Quilts were stacked thick as hay bales. In fact, some family members disappeared entirely beneath the patchwork mountains, only to be ID'd later by the occasional sneeze or snore. Some clever souls turned to nature's fuzzy sympathizers. Animals. Dogs were allowed, nay encouraged, to sleep indoors during the worst of the cold. There were even stories of pigs sleeping inside, nestled up to toddlers like pink, squealing space heaters. The family dog was no longer just man's best friend, but also man's foot warmer, child's pillow, and on particularly icy evenings, grandma's electric blanket, who occasionally runs out for scraps. Fireplaces, the centerpiece of frontier interiors, were critical but misleading. Pull a chair right up to one, and your boots might start melting while your back froze solid like a wool-clad popsicle. The heat had the staying power of a drunk drifter, present 1 minute and gone the next. As for chopping the wood to feed this pyromaniac pit, it involved venturing out into the woods with an axe and fingers that had gone on strike at the mere whisper of wind chill. Then there were the bed warmers. ingenious tools that settlers either inherited, built, or occasionally improvised after one too many frostbitten toes. One common contraption involved placing a cast iron pot filled with hot coals underneath the bedstead, an idea that was either life-saving or, if handled clumsily, the beginning of a new settlement, because the old one was now kindling. Of course, the original hot water bottle wasn't bottled at all. It was a brick, or a stone, heated in the hearth and carefully wrapped in cloth like a diapered devil. It was then tucked into bed to radiate its glow like a little lava nugget. It wasn't glamorous, but to cold, aching feet, it felt like a Roman spa. Still, warmth wasn't only a physical pursuit. Much of how settlers endured the frigid night came down to how they bunkered in together. Human proximity as prehistoric furnace. Picture it: parents, children, sometimes older cousins, and maybe the plug-cheeked uncle who smelled faintly of onions, all packed into a single bed like pioneer sardines. It wasn't ideal for personal space, but it left very little room for the cold. So what did they do when the mercury fell and the hearth crackled its final ember for the night? They told stories, sometimes whispered, sometimes exaggerated, often amusing. Tales of neighbors who had to chase their hats halfway to Kansas, or of Aunt Hester's cat, who once climbed inside the stovepipe and emerged not just singularly sooty, but somehow twice as cynical. And in those moments, wrapped in laughter, steam breath, and quilt stitched tight with stubborn hope, they found something stronger than heat. They found endurance. They found each other. They found the patience to stay put until the rooster eventually remembered to crow them into a marginally less freezing morning. But the endearing absurdity of surviving a night on the frontier didn't stop at bedtime rituals or coal-warmed bedding. No, it extended to the motley crew of makeshift insulation methods settlers conjured out of desperation, invention, and possibly a dash of delirium. The bed frame, if you could call it that, was little more than sticks and a hopeful imagination. Pioneer sleepers in the Old West often lay down on rope-strung frames, what was charmingly called a rope bed. These were essentially wooden rectangles with thick ropes laced across the middle like a giant spider web, offering just enough give to spare your spine, but not so much as to call it luxurious. Each night required a ritual of tightening the ropes with a special crank, hence the old expression, sleep tight. The "don't let the bedbugs bite" part, however, wasn't so much an expression as it was a nightly prayer. Now, let's picture one of these settlers climbing into bed after a long day of chopping wood, hauling water, and sternly squinting into the distance. The wind howled through chinks in the cabin wall. Icicles grew like stalactites from the roofline, and the frost on the inside of the window, for those that had one, resembled delicate spiderweb lace, the kind Victorian grandmothers embroidered when they weren't frantically knitting socks. Bedding was a mix of whatever you had and whatever you could bear to share. Buffalo hides were popular for warmth if you'd been fortunate or ruthless enough to obtain one. They were heavy, thick, and distinctly non-machine washable. Underneath, you might find a horsehair mattress that had long since committed mutiny, forming mysterious lumps and subtle peaks strong enough to sprain a rib. Blankets were prized beyond gold. Homespun wool, tattered quilts, sometimes patched together from old trousers or sacks that once held beans. Every thread told a story, most of them slightly itchy. Layering up was less fashion choice and more survival ritual. You didn't so much get into bed as you slowly lowered yourself into a fabric sarcophagus. Settlers slept in their clothes, sometimes even their coats and hats. A woman in Nebraska once boasted that her great-aunt wore the same woolen shawl every night for 43 years. It never left her shoulders, and frankly, neither did the smell. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of a bed. Children might be bundled 2 or 3 to a cot, with the youngest squished in the middle like a sleepy sandwich filling. The immigrant communities, Swedes, Germans, Norwegians, often brought with them dense folk wisdom and even denser comforters, nested atop straw-stuffed mattresses laid carefully on the floor. Certain traditions involved warming a brick in the hearth, wrapping it in cloth, and slipping it under the blanket like a primitive bed warmer. It gave a brief reprieve from the cold, and possibly a sense of false hope. Fires in the hearth were lovely until they weren't. A cabin might have had one central fireplace, bravely trying to warm several rooms, or at least the corners of a single room pretending to be several. Wood had to be gathered daily, by hand, often in snow, sometimes in conditions that defied polite complaint. Every log meant warmth, and every spark counted. But the moment the fire dimmed, the frost began peeling in. Pipes froze, water buckets hardened into solid blocks, and breath fogged into the air like puffs from a polite dragon. Some settlers got creative. A few towns had iron stoves, usually shared communally or passed around like an unspoken agreement of who'd get warmed this week. There were tales of people baking potatoes not to eat, but to clutch to their chests like toasty, edible teddy bears. Others heated up flat stones and tucked them under their bedding. If you heard someone muttering about their blessed rock, it might have been religious devotion, or it might have been a particularly reliable piece of granite. No one escaped the night unscathed. Frostbite, chilblains, and shivering were all common enough to be considered background noise. But there was also ingenuity. No central heating? Fine. Sleep with a dog. 2 dogs? Even better. Hence the delightful saying from colder corners of the frontier, it's a 3-dog night. In some homes, the family dog wasn't a pet, it was survival strategy. And so, beneath heavy quilts, with wool socks gently steaming from the fire's warmth and a hot brick nestled by their feet, the settlers drifted off to a kind of sleep unique to the exhausted, the frozen, and the grateful. Outside, the wind combed through cottonwood trees, reshaping the snowdrifts. Inside, bundled pioneers dreamed slow, warm dreams of spring. And by morning, with luck and enough layers, they would rise again to brave the frost. Now, the night may be icy, and the mattress a bit bumpy, but wouldn't you like to know what role corn husks played in bedtime on the prairie? The prairie wind had a particular flair for drama. By nightfall, it could whip across the land like a ghost in a bad mood, slipping through thin chinks in cabins, lifting hats off heads, and rattling shutters with the kind of flair usually reserved for overtired playwrights. And though the settlers of the American West were famously scrappy, they weren't immune to the pangs of such elemental poetry. You see, the American frontier of the 1800s had a lot of things: dusty optimism, land disputes, beards that could hide a pencil. But central heating? Not even close. In fact, keeping warm on the plains required equal parts ingenuity, exhaustion, and a dangerously loose definition of personal space. Most famously, families huddled inside what were gently and generously called sod houses. Those cheerful earthen dwellings made from the very turf underfoot. Think of them as early American eco-cabins, except instead of bamboo countertops and feng shui, there was more mud and a higher chance of sharing your home with several insects and the occasional morally flexible field mouse. Inside these sod homes, the fire wasn't just decorative, it was survival itself. A modest hearth, usually made from stacked stone or clay, if you were fancy, burned buffalo chips, twisted prairie grass, and whatever else could be coaxed into igniting. Buffalo chips, for the uninitiated, are not poker tokens or chocolate treats. They are, let's say, nature's most abundant and fragrant fossil fuel. In the vast treeless grasslands, one had to get creative. There was no shame in it, only smoke. The fire did its best, bless it, but couldn't reach every corner. As such, nights were chilly affairs. To fight off the bone-deep cold, settlers swaddled themselves in layers of wool, pelts, and hand-sewn patchwork blankets that were often heavier than the people themselves. It was not uncommon for couples to sleep so thoroughly bundled together that unwrapping in the morning was akin to trying to solve a quilt-based magic trick. And while we might think of cuddling today as a warm Hallmark movie moment, back then, it was active strategic body heat consolidation. Children slept beside siblings, cousins, whoever was nearby, and warm-blooded. Babies, wrapped like human burritos, were nestled beside parents or grandmothers. Preferably, the ones with broader laps or excellent storytelling skills. Clothing, by the way, was rarely removed overnight. It wasn't so much about modesty as it was about sanity. Nighttime wardrobe consisted of day shirts, an extra smock, trousers, socks, 2 hats, if available, and possibly a set of mittens knitted from leftover yarn, unraveled from a failed attempt at making curtains. Underwear aired out only when temperatures allowed. Otherwise, it accompanied you to bed like a particularly clingy roommate. What's more, the beds themselves weren't exactly dreamy havens. If you were lucky, you had a straw tick mattress, that's a cloth bag filled with straw, laid across ropes or wooden slats. But even those sagged by morning, resulting in a notorious condition called bedrop slump. Every so often, the ropes had to be tightened, hence the phrase sleep tight, which, you'll be glad to know, predates memory foam by approximately a century, and several hernias. Then there was the night watch, the humble ritual of making sure the fire didn't go out while the family slept. Usually, the task fell to whoever drew the short stick that week, or the person already up with intestinal distress, potato storage being what it was. They'd feed the embers, poke at the ash, and keep the household from freezing into a tableau vivant of 19th century resilience. Sometimes, someone would rise early, stoke the flames, and place heated stones or bricks near the bed to take the edge off. These warming stones were precursors to our modern bedside luxuries, like electric blankets, except made of rocks and less likely to be FDA approved. And when even all of this wasn't enough, when the wind howled and the fire hissed, and blankets couldn't outmatch the stars in their cold gleam, many settlers turned to the ultimate frontier luxury, storytelling. Tales were told in whispers, half dreamed and half remembered, passed along to distract the ears from the wind and the heart from the frost creeping in at the corners. And so, surrounded by wool, smoke, and whispers, our humble settlers drifted off. Not into comfort, perhaps, but into something stubbornly close. As the wind continues its nightly soliloquy outside those muddy walls, let's take a step further into the quiet routines that shape these firelit lives. As the stars scattered themselves lazily across the crisp frontier sky, and coyotes discussed their nightly business in the distance, settlers turned their minds not to dreams or romance, but to what might be the 19th century equivalent of survival Sudoku: how to sleep without freezing to death. You see, the Wild West wasn't exactly designed for comfort. One might imagine bold cowboys and stern-faced pioneers basking in the glow of a roaring hearth. But the truth sounded more like teeth chattering and garments rustling as half-frozen limbs attempted tangle-free sleep. Firewood was precious and often wet. Houses were drafted more like sieves than shelter, and insulation was a concept as foreign as indoor plumbing. The adobes, dugouts, and log cabins of the American frontier were, to generous observers, rustic, and to those with frostbitten toes, inadequate. Many homesteads were built fast, with little more than axe, hope, and calloused optimism. Drafts slipped through cracks like nosy ghosts, and the icy breath of winter had a house key to just about every cabin. So just how did they manage it? How did these brave souls drift off into dreams of spring without becoming part of the permafrost? Well, the answer was not always elegant, but it was creative. First, we have the human furnace effect, otherwise known as people piling together, like teacups in a packed cupboard. Family beds weren't just economical, they were life-saving. Children made excellent heat dispensers, and nobody complained if Grandma's snoring rattled the floorboards. Her body heat was gold. Entire families shared not only a bed, but roughly the same elbow space as sardines on a mission. Layers, too, were law. Settlers didn't simply get dressed in the morning. They emerged from a linen chrysalis layered with flannel, wool, and whatever animal was most recently cooperative. Sleep garments ranged from long johns to full bear pelts, an admittedly dramatic solution, but surprisingly effective. If it had fur or feathers and wasn't currently attacking, it might well become a blanket. Some pioneers went so far as to pre-warm their beds, while modern folks rely on heated pads or electric blankets. Quite spoiled, really. Frontier folks improvised. Heated stones were placed in the hearth and then transferred, gently one hopes, to beds wrapped in rags. These were known as bed warmers, though, to be precise. They were often just rocks with jobs. A hot potato placed in a sock and tucked under the sheets might toast your toes till dawn. And yes, the same potato might be your breakfast come morning, warmed by the dreams it had politely listened to all night. Still, for all the napping by firelight and the cozy bedtime rocks, nothing beat a well-constructed chimney. Chimneys were status symbols nearly as impressive as a cow that didn't escape nightly. A proper chimney meant consistent, controllable heat, an innovation not always given. Many early cabins suffered under the curses of what historians generously call experimental designs: smoky interiors, collapsing hearths, and one-room homes that smelled permanently of charred optimism. Even those without a fireplace weren't helpless. Fireless heat was found in body and ingenuity. Earthen floors were insulated using straw, rugs woven from who knows what, and even buffalo hides when luck allowed. Every inch of seam and crack in walls was stuffed with clay, mud, or any textile casualty no longer suitable for wear. Old shirts became window patches. Broken quilts became window glass. Draft stoppers weren't sewn, they were shoved. And then there were the nightcaps, not the whiskey sort, though, rest assured, many of those appeared after sundown, but literal knit hats worn to bed. Heat escapes famously from the scalp, and so a good nightcap wasn't just stylish, it was essential. Pa might look like a sad parliamentarian, and Ma might resemble a sheep on its day off, but by thunder, their heads were warm. All of it bred a sort of intimacy with the cold. It wasn't fought, not entirely. It was negotiated with. People became friends with shivers, learned the rhythm of frozen wood popping in fire, knew instinctively how to turn in their sleep without exposing vital organs to flirty breezes. Survival wasn't just about heat. It was about rhythm, resilience, and a remarkable ability to find warmth in each other, if not in their homes. And as dawn prepared its reluctant entrance over the silver plains, settlers stirred beneath their mountains of patched quilts, layered wool, and 6 other humans. Another cold night survived, with perhaps one less toe completely numb. Soon, they'd rise to stoke whatever coals had survived, re-knot their scarves, and face another day with frost on their moustaches and adventure in their near-frozen hearts. But before the fire is stirred and the snow-dusted boots are wrestled back on, there is still the story of what breakfast looked like when coffee froze in mid-pour and wind tried to blow the bacon off your plate. Picture the frost-dappled expanse of a 19th century prairie night. Miles of nothing but prairie grass crunching under snow, the wind sighing like an old man with complaints he's rehearsed for years, and a solitary log cabin huddled low against the elements. Inside, by the dim light of a flickering tallow candle, a settler family prepares for bed. Not with flannel pajamas or fleece-lined socks. Those would have been luxuries stacked toward the mythological, but with layers of wilting wool, fingers crossed for a not-too-cruel sunrise. One of the more unintentionally comedic but entirely sincere attempts to stay warm came in the form of something lovingly known as the trundle bed. Imagine a drawer for children, but it's a mattress. As nighttime settled over the frontier, little ones were slid under the adult bed, like potatoes stored for winter. Snug and low to the floor, they were kept comparably warm by body heat, proximity, and a thick dose of terrifying darkness. It wasn't uncommon for one child to murmur to another, "If you hear anything scuttling, pretend you didn't." The creatures of the prairie, after all, didn't observe bedtime propriety, but the adults had their own strategies too. Remember Central, heating wouldn't make its sassy debut until the 20th century. Pioneers lived in a world where the fireplace was not just for roasting cornmeal mush or cooking beans, until they achieved that famous Wild West consistency of chewing optional. It was also the main, and often only, source of heat. The better-off families might have a cast-iron stove, ominous and proud in the middle of the room, like a surly, smouldering uncle. These stoves were astonishing pieces of engineering, capable of both heating a stew and incinerating any mitten that came too close. The shuffle to bed was strategic. The fire's warmth would fade quickly as night deepened, so pioneer families developed a kind of human heat economy. Everyone slept swaddled in all available clothing and blankets, which were often scratchy, thoroughly lived-in wool. No scent of lavender detergent graced these bedclothes. Instead, they offered gentle whiffs of goat, chimney soot, an honest, hard-working body. And if you thought a good night's sleep consisted of one long, peaceful stretch from dusk to dawn, the settlers would politely disagree. Most folks in the 1800s observed what's now called segmented sleep. They'd drift off after dark, awaken for an hour or two around midnight, perhaps to tend the fire, pray, or have a quiet, reflective moment about why they moved to the bleak side of Kansas. Then they'd drift back into a second slumber until morning, if the coyotes and the creaking rafters permitted. Of course, body heat wasn't just a convenient byproduct of sleeping near your cousin Ephraim. It was a survival tactic. It's no wonder that many beds in frontier cabins were crammed with an entire family unit, parents, children, and on particularly frigid evenings, even the occasional guest. Privacy was more of a future aspiration than a current feature. There are accounts of settlers sleeping 5 to a mattress, feet tucked in mutual warmth, while everyone collectively tried not to. Acknowledge just how badly Jeremiah's boots smelled, even after he took them off. One lesser known but rather ingenious bedtime habit included heating a brick or a smooth stone over the fire, then wrapping it in cloth and tucking it under the covers to pre-warm the bed. Blissfully, this worked. Less blissfully, occasionally someone would forget to wrap the brick. Nothing disrupts your slumber quite like placing your thigh on a searing hot reality check. Still, out on the plains, compromise was a nightly ritual. Squeaking through the howling wind came the knowledge that comfort wasn't always part of the bargain, but resilience, that was built in, under patchwork quilts stitched from whatever spare cloth was left, old shirts, feed sacks, wedding dresses that had seen better barn dances. They slept, perhaps not comfortably, but deeply, because they had to. Outside, the moon hung like a bleached coin over the landscape, illuminating the frost-laced fences and the skeletal shapes of past cornfields. Inside, snores harmonized with the soft moaning of icy wind finding its way through the chinks in the log walls. It was a lullaby, frontier style, rough, real, and vaguely drafty. And somewhere, in the gentle hush between the crackling embers and the creaking timbers, ticked the quiet promise of morning. A morning that would begin another day of invention, improvisation, and the kind of stubbornness that built more than towns. It built warmth from nothing. That warmth, curious as it may seem, didn't come just from glowing fires or wool or bundled up children. It came from ingenuity. It came from people. And as the cold stars watched overhead, that very ingenuity was just beginning to get cozy. Let's see where it leads next. In the stillness of a prairie night, when the stars sparkled down like a million frosty lanterns and the wind yawned across the plains, settlers faced a nightly conundrum: how to avoid turning into human popsicles. You see, there were no hand warmers, no electricity, and unless a traveling stove salesman had miraculously galloped by, no real heating options beyond sheer stubbornness and, well, livestock. Enter the buffalo robe, a blanket so thick, luxurious, and fragrant, though not always pleasantly so, that it made even the harshest winter night marginally survivable. These were not store-bought throws from an upscale frontier pottery barn. They were actual buffalo hides, often with the fur still intact, cured with a method somewhere between haphazard and experimental. The result? A bed cover that could insulate you from sub-zero wind and also, quite possibly, from ever dating again, due to the smell of warm, aging hide. Pioneers often slept in their full clothes, boots and all, wrapped tightly in whatever layers could be spared. Flannel, wool, and literally any scrap of old curtain fabric from Aunt Mildred's last attempt at fancy parlor decor got repurposed into nightwear. Chic? No. Efficient? Absolutely. And it meant fewer painful encounters with freezing buckles in the morning. One necessity, unglamorous yet vital: the hot rock. Not a band, not a flavor of chewing tobacco. A literal rock, heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth, then tucked into bed like a toasty little secret. If you were lucky, you had more than one, to place at your feet, your sides, or even under your armpits, strategically arranged like a primitive heating pad designed by nature and desperation. Of course, not everyone had rocks to spare, so some settlers innovated with bricks, kettles filled with boiling water, or, brace yourself, a warmed-up potato. This last technique had the added benefit of providing a midnight snack, should sleep prove elusive. Potatoes, the Swiss Army knife of the 19th century. Then there were the bed partners. And we don't mean the romantic kind. Families, especially in smaller cabins, bundled together under a shared coverlet like a pile of root vegetables in storage. Children on the inside, parents and sometimes cousins on the outside, all huddled up for what we might romantically call communal warmth, but what effectively resembled human lasagna. Pets, too, earned their keep. Dogs nestled under covers, and cats found the softest, most forgettable part of your body to sleep on. Occasionally, if one was truly blessed, or had no allergies, there'd even be a goat curled up nearby, radiating barnyard warmth and restorative bleats. But even amidst all these strategies, the bitter truth was that many pioneers simply got used to it. Cold became a companion. Settlers would joke, somewhat stiffly, about waking up with their hair frozen to the wall. Morning routines often included breaking the ice, not socially, but literally, in the water bucket. The concept of indoor plumbing was a fantasy, and anyone needing a restroom trip at 2 a.m. had a choice. Venture to the icy outhouse or use the chamber pot, an invention which sounded far more glamorous than its actual content suggested. Still, the human spirit is nothing if not creatively obstinate. Quilts became both artistic expression and survival tool, made from scraps of clothing, woven stories of relatives, migration, and at times, sheer boredom. Some even embroidered messages onto their quilts, little stitched diary entries that survived long past their owners. And what could be more comforting on a sub-zero morning than rising stiff and sore under a woolen patchwork that read, "Freezing here, hope you're warmer where you are." As nightfall blanketed the plains once again, those crude candlelit cabins filled with quiet rustlings, babies suckling, a log popping in the hearth, someone muttering about lost moccasins. Outside, wolves howled now and then, adding their lonely notes to the wind's ceaseless lullaby. But within, swaddled in layers of buffalo hide, homespun wool, hot potatoes and sharing elbows, the settlers survived. Not glamorously, not effortlessly, but with a kind of weary dignity only the cold or history textbooks could inspire. And somewhere out on those moonlit prairies, as another night slipped softly into sky-colored dreams, something else stirred, an idea flickering like a fire just catching kindling. What should go on your feet when shoes themselves can't keep the cold out? Not every battle in the Wild West was fought with bullets and bravado. Some were quieter, slower, chillier. The silent standoff between a single settler and the unrelenting cold was one of the sturdiest jewels of the frontier. And while outlaws might have won newspapers and ballads, the true winter legends were the ones who figured out how to not wake up as a settler-shaped icicle come morning. Truly, a heroic legacy forged not with revolvers, but with rabbit pelt socks and suspicious optimism. Much like today's half-hearted snowball fights and cozy complaints about drafty apartment windows, the cold was a shared enemy. But without the comfy crutches of central heating, fleece blankets, or thermal mugs of cinnamon spice salvation, settlers had to get creative. They had to get cold, with style. Let's begin with perhaps the most glamorous part of this frigid frontier life: sleeping arrangements. Picture it, the prairie wind howling like a coyote with a toothache, snow tapping gently at the wooden slats, pretending to be walls, and you, curled up on a pile of straw with a buffalo robe pulled around your shoulders like a cold-weather toga with delusions of grandeur. Buffalo robes were a prize in those winters. Thick, strong, and, if you didn't think too hard about where they came from, surprisingly cozy. Settlers would line the inside of their bunks with these durable, fur-lined blankets. hoping to hold in body heat like it was gold dust. If you were extra lucky, you might also have a quilt. And not just any quilt, one made by a relative with too much time and too many scraps of the old calico dresses. But the real unsung heroes, the hot bricks, no, not a frontier cooking show. Settlers would quite literally heat bricks or stones in their fireplaces, nestling them into the toe of their beds, or wrapping them in cloth to serve as one-time use heating pads. Of course, these made for mixed success. You had to be sure the stone wasn't porous and about to burst, with an angry hiss under heat. Nothing ruins a night's sleep quite like an exploding mineral and a slight singeing of one's socks. There were also more social solutions. The group snuggle approach, which anthropologists have gently dubbed communal heat retention, was less about intimacy and more about survival. Families often slept packed together like mismatched spoons in a chaotic drawer. Children on the inside, parents on the outside, and occasionally the dog right across everyone's feet, playing a rather informal role as bed warmer in chief. Speaking of the canine contribution, dogs weren't merely foot warmers. They were furry sentinels of the night. They'd alert you to coyotes, defend the chickens, and help your toes forget they were mere centimeters from frostbite. Time and again, diaries from settlers mentioned dogs as indispensable nighttime allies. One account from Nebraska described a collie named Hector, who had the warmth of a stove and the soul of a minister. Fidelis, lovable, and mostly covered in hay by morning. But let's not forget the classic frontier stove, the iron heart of any homestead. These compact cast iron stoves were as temperamental as they were essential. Good ones could keep a small cabin warm till morning. Bad ones, well, some memories of childhood involve waking up with frost on one's bedding and a sense of betrayal usually reserved for soap operas and spoiled apples. Still, the stove had to be fed. Wood had to be split, hauled and stacked. A job that, curiously, never got warmer no matter how much wood you chopped. Kids often earned their keep through firewood duty, learning quickly that frozen fingers are the universe's way of suggesting maybe gloves weren't optional after all. And then there was the art of banking the fire, a technique in which glowing coals were smothered with ashes at bedtime to keep a slow burn through the night, ready to roar with just a whisper of kindling come morning. It didn't always work. Sometimes it silently betrayed you and turned into a sad pile of cold ash, and sometimes you thought it failed, but lifted a log and discovered the orange heart still alive, waiting like a patient guardian. And when all else failed, you simply endured. You clutched your knees, exhaled into your hands, and believed in the promise of morning sun. Comfort was never guaranteed, but resilience was. And while the cold howled and creaked through the trees, stories of warmer places, funnier days, and better fires were shared under whispered breath. Stories that stitched their way into folklore, layering the past with cozy exaggeration and hopeful memory. But surviving wasn't just about warmth. It was also about what you ate before the storm rolled in. Out on the open plains, where the wind howled like a lonely coyote that had just read bad poetry, settlers found themselves engaged in a nightly dance with frostbite. And yet, somehow, they learned to fight the bitter cold, using nothing but resourcefulness, stubbornness, and whatever wasn't already on fire. Now, if you were lucky enough to have a dugout cabin, yes, a literal hole in the ground, you had at least one advantage: the earth itself. It turns out that dirt doesn't get quite as chilly as air, and with thick sod walls and a low ceiling that even the squirrel-brained could bump their heads on, A dugout could trap heat better than you'd think. Sure, it smelled like damp roots and existential regret, but that was a small price to pay for not freezing to death. Then there were the soddies, houses built almost entirely out of sod bricks. The windows were few. The insulation, excellent, also known to collapse during wet weather or when a cow leaned against it too hard. Imagine being nestled in your blanketed bed of sagebrush and goose feathers when Bessie the milk cow accidentally turns your living room into her bedroom. It was rustic meets livestock. Furniture helped too. Not for warmth necessarily, but as flammable backup. When fuel was scarce, settlers resorted to burning everything that wasn't nailed down, and sometimes even that. Broken chairs, fence posts, and pages of last year's almanac all became emergency kindling. Legend tells of an old man in Kansas who burned the entire family Bible one chapter at a time, except for Leviticus, which he used as insulation. Too dry, he reportedly muttered. On truly frigid nights, when the fire gave up around 2 a.m. and the cold sat in your lap like an uninvited cat, the settlers turned to what he can only describe as the human burrito method. Families, mothers, fathers, children, assorted pets, and the occasional cousin passing through, huddled together in the same bed, layered in blankets, quilts, coats, and, if lucky, some accidental dog hair. Privacy, non-existent, but warmth, achieved. Even the way they dressed for bed was a survival strategy. Scratchy wool long johns were worn with utter disregard for fashion. Mittens, bonnets, scarves. Yes, indoors and under the covers. It's said some people even wore their boots to bed, because ice-cold leather soles first thing in the morning were, medically speaking, offensive to the senses. Of course, no discussion of nighttime warmth would be complete without mentioning the homesteader's best friend, the warming pan. These shallow metal pans would be filled with coals and dragged between the sheets to warm the bed before climbing in. Now, to the modern ear, this sounds wildly reckless. Fire plus flammable mattress plus sleepy. Pioneer math equals disaster. And yet, like so many charmingly dangerous practices of the past, they made it work. Usually. Then there were the hot bricks, also called footstones, baked in the firebox, wrapped in flannel or old newspapers, preferably those not yet burned, and tucked under the covers near the toes. As one diary put it, the bricks were nice, except when they wandered. In other words, accidental brick-to-face contact was not entirely unheard of. A midnight surprise of its own kind. Speaking of which, we mustn't neglect chamber pots, the unsung heroes of cold nights, because leaving the house in a blizzard to answer nature's call. Not ideal. A chamber pot wasn't warm per se, but it did save you from frostbitten extremities or getting eaten by a disgruntled badger, both of which were statistically plausible events. And let's not forget about the bedfellows whose snoring might have driven you to contemplate violence in warmer seasons, but whose body heat became a cherished resource by winter. The nightly ritual was simple. Extinguish the lantern, burrow into what covers you had, align limbs with your appointed heat source, and hope neither of you rolled too far toward the occasionally frosty wall. If you did, you simply yelped, scooched back toward the middle, and mentally cursed the great American prairie. In every drafty cabin and frost-framed dugout, people found ways to hibernate in their own humble way, curled beneath weighty quilts that might have once been curtains, or old coats stitched into squares by firelight. And as the northern winds whistled lullabies through the cracks, the settlers drifted into sleep. Not warm precisely, but just warm enough to dream. Tomorrow, you'll see how the Wild West mind turned to an unlikely source of warmth, livestock body heat. And yes, it does get weirder. Despite what Hollywood might suggest, not every settler in the American West wore 10-gallon hats, rode into town with a swaggering spittoon jingle, and survived winter by the sheer heat of their own rugged charm. No, many of them were freezing. Endearingly, stubbornly freezing. Let's talk windows, or rather, the absence thereof. Out on the frontier, glass wasn't just expensive, it was borderline mythical. In some prairie towns, a single pane of actual glass might be passed around like a church, offering plate or shown off like a family heirloom. That there's real see-through rock, some might say in honest awe, brought in from way back east. If you were a settler and a storm was howling, you had to batten down the hatches with whatever was handy. And handy often meant oiled paper, animal hide, or, on creative nights, flour sacks stiffened with lard. The result? A rustic kaleidoscope of patchy light, some unfortunate smells, and not a single ounce of insulation. But let's not judge. These folks were resourceful. Windows didn't keep out much heat anyway. And so what if your entire house sounded like a wind-whistling harmonica at night? It was charming, in a deeply frostbitten sort of way. Let's step inside one of those beloved wooden cabins built by sheer faith, hope, and a liberal interpretation of carpentry. Cozy, right? That wall over there is made of cottonwood logs stacked with chilled optimism. Between the logs, chinking, the old settler's secret recipe of mud, straw, ash, and occasionally bits of broken dreams. In other words, it was like caulking your house with chunky soup. At night, the cold would slink down from the roof beams and curl up beside the bed like an uninvited raccoon. Not that you always had a full bed. Privacy was a luxury, and heat was democratized. It wasn't unusual for 5 or more family members, plus a loyal dog and probably a few field mice operating a small side business, to sleep together for warmth. And speaking of clothing, nobody slipped into anything more comfortable when it came time to sleep. Quite the opposite. Settlers often slept in every single item of clothing they owned. Shirts, trousers, extra socks, scarves, undergarments. Yes, even that one itchy petticoat that made you feel like a walking cactus. All of it. Buttons strained, seams groaned. The entire family became a pile of textile-laden humanity, looking like a sentient laundry basket. And heavens, the beds. While the well-to-do might have imported metal springs or carved frames, most settlers got to know the intimate joys of rope beds and straw mattresses. The rope was supposed to be taught, but over time, particularly if Uncle Milo had a habit of plopping down like a sack of potatoes, it slacked. So when you hear the phrase, sleep tight, it really was sage advice, as in, please retighten the ropes before you collapse this evening, lest you wake up in a woven cotton hammock of despair. The straw mattress didn't help much either. Depending on what the farmers had harvested, your bedding might be filled with corn husks, prairie grass, or last season's oat straw. Surprisingly comfy at first, until it shifted and cratered, giving you the sensation of sleeping on a burlap bag of indecisive porridge. But never fear, there was always the fire. Ah yes, the fireplace, the heart of the cabin, the soul of survival. Except that most of the heat decided to go straight up the chimney like a hot balloon's early retirement. Settlers knew this, of course, and so they huddled as close as they could without actually setting themselves ablaze. Children rotated like slow roasting marshmallows, and socks were arranged with care on nearby chairs, each drying with stubborn hope that they wouldn't be frozen solid again come morning. Still, every flame, however meager, was a sort of promise of warmth, of life eked out against the night, of spiteful triumph over the wind's chilly demands. And just as winter nights creaked onward, the settlers didn't just endure, they evolved, with one surprisingly prickly companion, shuffling its way into survival lore like a porcupine-shaped hot water bottle. Because when your feet are cold and the fire's gone out, nothing says bedtime like the warm heft of a live hedgehog. But that's another snuggly surprise for next time. Snow was nature's way of reminding pioneers that even the Almighty had a flair for dramatic entrances. A silent, icy blanket would descend overnight, transforming settlements into ghostly outlines of cabins and fences, like some divine powdered sugar sprinkle to sweeten the trial of frontier living. And yet, for the early settlers of the American West, this frosty flourish was less picturesque and more perilous. After all, you try using a corn husk mattress as insulation during a blizzard and see how poetic you feel. Sleeping through such conditions required more than grit. It required creativity, tenacity, and the stubborn refusal to freeze to death. Consider the technique known as hot rock bedding. A name that sounds like an alternative spa treatment, but in practice was more survival strategy than relaxation ritual. Settlers would heat large rocks in their fireplaces, then wrap them in thick cloth and tuck them into the foot of their beds. It wasn't particularly glamorous, but neither was hypothermia. There's something oddly intimate about the image of a family passing hot stones around like treasured heirlooms, each carrying a little of the hearth's last warmth. More valuable than silver or gold in the winter months was a shared bed. Entire families would pile together at night, hands, feet, elbows, and the occasional cold nose in someone's back, all wrapped in layers of threadbare quilts and hope. The body heat method, used with great success by penguins and prairie families alike, was a simple equation. The more people under the blankets, the less likely one would wake up frozen. Modesty took a backseat to survival, and anyone lucky enough to have a plump Aunt Edna was particularly grateful come December. And then there were those blessed with livestock. A warm cow in the barn was more useful than a volatile neighbor with a shotgun. Farmers would sometimes even sleep in the barn with their animals during particularly brutal spells. Nothing like cuddling up beside a cow named Bessie for 8 hours to re-evaluate your life choices. Cows, unlike spouses, don't complain about cold feet. When it came to rattling windows and drafty floors, the settlers' war against the weather was an ongoing siege. Windows were packed with anything from cloth to newspaper to dried mud. An interior design choice dictated entirely by the wind's ambition to move in uninvited. Doors were sealed with rugs, or, in more desperate cases, the family dog, who often got the raw deal in the Block the Breeze initiative. Poor canine. Those enduring the night inside a sod house had it both better and worse. On one hand, those thick walls of earth offered insulation superior to any hastily built wooden shack. On the other hand, they also played host to insects, rodents, and the occasional bit of ceiling collapsing onto your forehead mid-dream. Coziness, it turns out, was a spectrum. For particularly determined do-it-yourselfers, makeshift sleeping bags emerged, fashioned from buffalo hides, deer skins, and even layered quilts stitched with dried grass. Imagine slipping into a portable grass and hide cocoon, whispering a cheerful good night while crouched near a dwindling fire. These makeshift nests transform people into burrito-shaped survivalists, barely distinguishable from their bedding. Romantic? Perhaps not. Effective? mostly. Unless, of course, you rolled over onto your hot rock. There were also the night watch routines, a rotating system where family members took turns stoking the fire throughout the evening. Nothing like being 12 years old, shivering at 2 a.m., poking embers with a stick while trying not to fall face first into flame. It built character and resentment, but mostly character. As dawn peeked across the frozen plains, thin ribbons of smoke curled from chimneys like exhausted sighs. Children woke up with noses red as radishes, their breath forming cloudy thoughts in the morning chill. Quilts were shaken out, fires revived, and frost-covered boots warmed beside embers. The morning ritual was as sacred as it was cold. No coffee in sight, but plenty of lard biscuits and silent appreciation for waking up at all. This chilly symphony of snoring, fire tending, and shivering might seem absurd to us in the age of central heating, but for the hardy settlers, it was simply life. A clumsy, uncomfortable, occasionally itchy ode to endurance. And as the days stretched into winter's deep heart, a new challenge waited quietly outside. Snowstorms so epic, they made even the cows rethink their enthusiasm for open prairie living. On a biting winter evening in 1871, in a tiny shack that looked like a sideways outhouse with dreams, a settler named Alma McGrew stirred a boiling pot of soup made mostly from snow, pepper, and hopeful imagination. The wind outside howled like it had just stubbed its toe on a cactus, and the cabin walls, made of uneven logs and optimism, creaked under its icy breath. The truth was, heating a frontier home wasn't so much about getting warm as it was about getting less cold. The fundamental physics of not freezing to death had to be reinterpreted daily, preferably before sundown. For your average settler, central heating meant placing the fire in the center of the room and hoping your eyebrows didn't become collateral damage. Fireplaces, if present, were crude and fairly opinionated. They smoked when they felt moody and mostly kept warm to themselves. Many folks built their own chimneys from mud, stone, and whatever structurally ambitious squirrels weren't using at the time. These chimneys often worked until they didn't, at which point they either collapsed, caught fire, or both, depending on the kind of excitement chosen by destiny that week. More pragmatic cabins had cast iron stoves, dropped off by enterprising peddlers whose idea of delivery was slapping the thing off a wagon from 20 yards away. These stoves, once installed, were fiercely temperamental. The only instruction manual was experience, and experience came in the form of third-degree burns and smoking socks. But once tamed, they were champions of conservation, warming hands and soup simultaneously, and radiating just enough heat to keep frostbite hovering politely at the windows rather than barging in. Of course, fuel was everything. Wood had to be chopped, stacked, and practically begged to light. In the coldest months, it was common to ration firewood as if it were gold, or cookies. This was not because settlers wanted to be stingy with heat, but because acquiring each log cost them a small fraction of their will to live. A tree didn't just volunteer politely. No, it had to be spotted, felled with dull axes, dragged through snowbanks, chopped into pieces and split. Usually just before dinner, when you'd hope to have hands that could still hold a spoon. Some settlers grew to love their woodpiles more than their extended families. There are journals that literally contain entries like, "Frost on the beard again this morning. Martha says she saw a squirrel sunbathing on the stove." Built up the woodpile to 6 cords, a good stack, a noble stack. For those who'd grown weary of chopping until their arms resembled overcooked noodles, buffalo chips, also known as prairie gold, cow patties, plop logs, or dinner's competition, were a common alternative. These were dried buffalo droppings collected carefully, sometimes with tongs, but more often with that magical ingredient: desperation. They didn't smell like roses, but they burned hot and made for good conversation starters, or enders, depending on the nose of the visitor. But warmth wasn't only about flame. It was about layering. Ah yes, the eternal fashion statement of the frontier: 6 shirts, 3 petticoats, 1 woolen shawl, and a slightly haunted rabbit fur hat. Settlers went to sleep wearing everything they owned, including some things they didn't. Bedmates weren't just for companionship. They were strategic heat sources. Whole families, dogs, and occasionally chickens would huddle under quilts so thick you needed a permit to lift them. And then there were the rocks. Heated by the fire and wrapped in old cloth, warm rocks became toasty bedtime companions, kind of like hot water bottles, except extremely judgmental and liable to burn through your socks if you got too cozy. Still, settlers cherished them. Nothing quite said good night, like tucking a smooth piece of geological history at your feet. But no matter how good the preparations, the wild western night was always just a bit colder than expected, as if the wind itself had taken offense at how unbothered you were during the day. You might get warm for a moment near the stove, the flames crackling gently, casting shadows that danced around your cabin like shy ghosts. Then the fire would die down, logs would need replacing, socks would need turning, and someone would mutter, "Next year we move south." In the quiet scraping of chairs drawn nearer to the hearth, and in the muffled laughter under too many quilts, there existed a kind of stubborn peace, a resolve wrinkled by long days and frosted beards. Through all the chill and hardship, they found their ways to fend off the frost. And yet, as the night deepens and the wind hums a lullaby through the chinks in the walls, something even rarer arrives: silence. A stillness so heavy it presses into the floorboards. But tomorrow, well, tomorrow brings the food challenges, because bread doesn't rise when the dough is frozen solid. As autumn dwindled into the brittle quiet of midwinter, settlers on the American frontier faced a peculiar sort of trial. Neither war nor famine, though those sometimes visited too, but the endlessly inconvenient reality of needing to use the bathroom when it was 10 below zero outside. We tend to imagine these rugged frontier folk as stoic and unflappable, hewn from seasoned pine and determination. But stoicism has its limits, and one of them is needing to drop your long johns in a snowdrift at 3 a.m. Enter the unsung hero of winter survival, the chamber pot. Yes, the humble porcelain bucket with a handle, smuggled beneath beds like a Victorian contraband. In the flickering glow of a kerosene lamp, few things inspired more middle-of-the-night gratitude than not having to don boots, trousers, and 3 layers of moral fortitude just to pay nature's fee. Not that chamber pots were glamorous. They were often discreetly disguised. In fancy households, they might be tucked into delicate wooden benches with lids, like a furniture prank only 19th century people would find passable. In log cabins, they were usually honest about their purpose and just sat there, unapologetically moistening the air. The pots had to be emptied, of course, and this duty usually fell to someone with the weakest negotiating position in the household. Children were ideal candidates for this glorious responsibility. They were small, nimble, and, crucially, living at home rent-free. But on especially frigid mornings, the pot's contents might solidify a bit, turning the task into something between a household chore and amateur sculpture removal. It is, perhaps, small comfort that these were the moments when frontier life taught character most thoroughly. Beyond the bedpan, settlers had to negotiate with another bitter winter adversary: the total lack of indoor plumbing. Bathing, when it happened at all, involved hauling buckets of water from a frozen creek, breaking the ice first, then warming the water over a stove. It was a half-day's work for 15 minutes of hygiene. As a result, many people simply didn't bother for long stretches. One popular phrase from the frontier era was Sunday bath, which, to be clear, implied a once-weekly commitment, not something that happened every day between hymnals. Clothing, too, bore the brunt of winter deprioritization. Layers were thick, itchy, and constant. Wool was the fabric of choice, not because it was pleasant, heavens no, but because it still insulted the cold even when damp. Frontier families would often wear the same woolen underclothes for weeks, and to a curious visitor bold enough to ask about a smell, the answer was simple. That's just what surviving smelled like. Drying laundry, when it happened, became performance art. Shirts and socks were draped across chairs by the stove, sometimes crisped into new shapes overnight. On especially chilly evenings, damp garments froze into avant-garde sculptures. One pioneer diary notes the author found Pa's union suit in the shape of a startled owl. As for staying warm overnight, some families would rely on shared body heat, huddled like spoons in an iron pot. Large families sometimes all slept in a single room, if not a single bed. Imagine 4 or 5 children bundled like puppies under a patchwork quilt that doubled as both bedding and indoor insulation. Snoring, elbow jousting, and the occasional nighttime collision with a chamber pot were all part of the experience. Fanciful props like bed warmers, flat metal pans filled with hot coals, slipped between bed linens to preheat your straw mattress, were a luxury. More common was simply baking one's backside next to the stove before sprinting to bed with a shout of "Don't let the fire go out." And truly, if there was one rule to frontier winter living, it was, do not let the fire go out, because if it did, getting it back wasn't as easy as flicking a switch or summoning a digital assistant. One might have to walk a mile to a neighbor, embers protected in an iron skillet under a damp cloth. Or, if especially unlucky, you'd need to start a new fire from scratch, with flint, kindling, hope, and a prayer to whatever saint watched over frostbitten fingers and smoke-addled lungs. So much rested on that stove: the warmth of the room, the comfort of meal preparation, the slight but vital edge over the cold gnawing at the door. Embers were guardians and friends. Losing them was like losing the last light on earth. Still, despite it all, the pioneers did more than survive. They adapted, they joked, they learned to cherish the fleeting sighs of warmth, the shared body heat, and yes, even the rattling, frosty chamber pot. And as we draw the blanket of history a little tighter around us, we'll turn our attention next to a certain alliance of warmth and fluff. The ancient, time-tested companionship between people and their livestock in winter. A moo in the right place could mean the difference between freezing or snoring peacefully through the long, wind-swept night. Imagine now, if you will, a snow-blown stretch of prairie under a sky so clear it might almost be suspect. It's silent, save for the hiss of winter wind brushing over frozen scrub. The canvas of night is painted with 1,000 stars, but not one of them offers warmth. Inside a one-room cabin made mostly out of stubbornness and unlikely optimism, a family of 5 bundles together like mismatched spoons in a drawer. With no insulation, no central heating, and absolutely no interest in scientific innovation just yet, our settlers relied on the sacred art of body heat, and when desperation demanded, less orthodox methods. Enter the bed warmer. Now don't be misled. The bed warmer was not a high professional, nor was it someone particularly affectionate. It was often a shallow metal pan on a long handle, filled with glowing coals and slid beneath the covers an hour or so before bedtime. It sounded cozy in theory, until you accidentally lit your mattress on fire, which was, historically speaking, frowned upon. But the real heroes of winter nights weren't metal pans. They were the children. That's right. In many households, the smallest family members became mobile insulation. Parents would gently discourage complaints like, "It's cold," by lovingly tucking them between two larger bodies and declaring them heat burritos. In an unfortunate twist of fate, being the middle child at bedtime was dangerously literal. You were pressed, wedged, and steam-sealed between siblings until you either warmed up or achieved enlightenment. This technique might sound slightly Dickensian, but do remember, duvets had not swept across the plains yet. Quilts were stitched from old flour sacks, worn-out dresses, and anything that once had the modest decency to retain warmth. Some quilts whispered family history in patchwork. Others silently screamed, "Help, I used to be an undergarment." Adding to the ambience, windows were sealed with rag-stuffed cracks, and, if you were particularly lucky, flattened pieces of waxed paper to stop the wind from converting your living space into a walk-in freezer. Glass windows were rare, and more often than not, smashed tennis elbow money out of the budget. Pa would shake his head and say something like, "Why do we need to see outside? It's just more white." Now, at the center of these nightly freeze fests was the heart of any pioneer cabin, the stove. Most commonly, it was a cast iron contraption that both heated the house and tried to kill you, depending on how well it had been fed. It demanded kindling, then small logs, then larger ones, and then infinite patience, as it slowly produced a heat so uneven it could simultaneously melt your boots and give your elbows frostbite. Waking up beside the stove was like falling asleep in the Sahara and waking in Siberia. You could go to bed sweaty and wake up with your socks frozen to the floor. The truly shrewd families developed rotation tactics, as in, you'd rotate your body through the night like a chicken on a spit. Head toward the fire, feet toward the fire, left side, right side, anything to avoid waking up with one half cozy and the other auditioning for a life as a snowman's internal organs. Still, the cold had a way of sneaking in. The logs, after all, eventually burned down. Ash piled up. Wind moaned through every knot in the wood-planked wall. So people turned to bedtime performances. Long stories, long prayers. Gossip, too, warmed the room, especially if there was scandal from another homestead. Did you hear? Ethel brushed her hair on a Wednesday, in full view of the barn. And then there were pets. Cats nestled themselves under blankets like traitorous puddings, having manipulated their way off the barn floor. Dogs, those clumsy sweethearts, were personal foot heaters whose loyalty was only matched by their spectacular gas. Animals didn't just offer comfort. They offered confirmation that, yes, your toes did still exist, because something was snoozing on top of them. This was the nightly ritual of thousands. Nothing that resembled comfort, and yet so seamlessly human. Men and women who had spent their days splitting wood, raising lean-to barns, and bartering with the concept of maybe tomorrow, curled up in beds that were little more than softened benches, whispered good nights, and quietly hoped they wouldn't wake up with their eyelids frozen shut. But just beyond those shaky walls, under the owl's watchful gaze and a sky bluer than any ink ever bottled, the wheel of winter turned. slowly, icy, but reliably. And as the flames dwindled in the stove and everyone found their pocket of warmth, however improvised, it was clear that survival wasn't just about luck or logs. It was about adaptation and thick socks, if you could find them. Now, let's rest a moment longer with our settlers, because soon we'll discover what happens when a town gets bold, bands together, and decides it deserves a schoolhouse, even if it's made entirely of unpacked ambition and a roof prone to collapse. As winter curled its long fingers around the western plains, settlers found that mere survival required a ballet of creative discomforts. While the eastern cities were beginning to flirt with coal stoves and heating grates out on the frontier, warmth remained more of a hopeful suggestion than a guarantee. But never let it be said that prairie folk lacked ingenuity or a slightly reckless sense of optimism. Let us step gently into a one-room sod house cloaked in snow, like a frosted cake carved out of the earth. Inside, the atmosphere shared a temperature profile uncomfortably close to the outside, only perhaps supplemented with the nostalgic aroma of damp wool and scorched cornmeal. Here, heat was not produced so much as it was politely requested from the universe, with mixed results. In these frigid hideouts, the soul of winter resistance was the wood-burning stove. No, not the charming cast-iron kind with floral engravings and delicate knobs, but more the find whatever didn't rot and make it flammable variety. Fuel was priceless and painfully rare. On the treeless plains, firewood became a myth passed down through wistful bedtime stories. Instead, settlers relied on what was generously referred to as prairie fuel, which sounds poetic until you learn it's just a genteel term for dried buffalo droppings. Yes, cow chips, nature's least glamorous currency, were collected, stacked, and burned cheerfully. Pioneer children were often tasked with this rustic treasure hunt, scampering across bleak fields like little chimney sweeps of the prairie. It was, in essence, the world's coldest Easter egg hunt, with lower prestige and considerably less chocolate. When, lighting the fire, one had to treat the stove like a moody old uncle. A touch too much kindling, and the smoke would bellow in protest, filling the home like an amateur magician's failed disappearing act. Too little, and the room would remain as frigid as a banker's handshake. Once operational, however, that stove became the communal sun. Families would orbit it closely, sometimes rotating like chickens on a slow spit to warm both sides equally. Oftentimes, warmth was achieved less by raising the temperature of the room and more by layering humans like flannel-clad lasagna. Entire families, parents, children, and unfortunate visiting relatives would sleep pressed together beneath a fortress of quilts so dense it could double as a mild avalanche. And the quilts themselves, a historical monument stitched from more than just fabric. Scraps of worn-out trousers, bits of flour sacks, even old curtains repurposed after their final theatrical flair. Each square told a story, usually, about hard winters, stubborn mules, and the time Aunt May lost a boot in the outhouse during a snowstorm. She got it back, the boot, not her dignity. For additional warmth at night, especially when stuck in isolated cabins that creaked like they were telling ghost stories to themselves, settlers employed the time-honored technique of heating a brick. This involved placing a brick near the fire, wrapping it in rags, and sliding it into bed before retiring. The brick, warm and vaguely dangerous, would radiate heat for just enough time to help you fall asleep before freezing solid again and potentially bruising your shin by morning. Some ingenuity came from the world of agriculture. farmers and ranchers would coax their animals into semi-enclosed lean-tos adjacent to the home. It wasn't just kindness, though the cows never complained. It was thermal strategy. The biomass of several large mammals exudes a surprising amount of warmth. Settlers learned quickly that the line between livestock enclosure and chapter of the home was mostly philosophical. Of course, many a cozy plan was foiled by the wind. The Great Plains wind was not content with mere gustiness. It was an existential force, one that howled through gaps in walls, rattled windows right off their fastenings, and whistled holiday tunes of its own devising. Settlers stuffed cracks with anything available: cloth, dried grass, newspaper, even page after page of Sears catalogues, which then doubled as toilet paper. Truly, nothing went to waste, including, quite literally, waste. But the heart kept beating, the stovepipe kept smoking, the cattle snored next to the outhouse, and huddled beneath their weighty patchwork quilts, dreaming of spring and Sunday stew, the settlers endured, half frozen, half hopeful, and entirely too close. Tomorrow, perhaps, they'd try to fix the draft behind the butter churn, or patch the hole in the outbuilding where the goats kept escaping to visit the neighbors. Or maybe, just maybe, figure out why the chimney now puffed smoke inward after every third pot of beans. But for tonight, the fire burned low, the quilts wore heavy, and the bricks glowed faintly warm beneath cold toes. Somewhere in the coffee-stained dusk of the 1870s, amid winds that whispered like nosy neighbors through the chinks in every wall, settlers of the American frontier were engaged in a nightly ritual far more daunting than taming cattle or shoeing ornery mules, staying warm enough not to freeze solid before breakfast. Now, you might think, surely they had enough firewood and fur to make it through a chilly night. But that would be giving the situation a bit too much credit. The fact is, much of the Wild West was about as well insulated as a cheesecloth raincoat, and just as absorbent. A log cabin in Montana, it often had more gaps than logs. A sod house on the prairie. It was quite literally a dirt box with aspirations. Heating one's home began with not freezing one's eyebrows off before even getting into bed. Firewood, essential as it was a precious commodity. Many settlers had to hike great distances, sometimes several miles, to collect a reasonable supply. You could always tell a newcomer by the look of hope in their eyes as they began the trek out, and the hollow stare of someone recalculating every life choice they'd ever made by the time they returned. Even then, burning wood efficiently was an art form, one that frequently eluded beginners. If you burned it too fast, you had a roaring fire followed by a long, icy silence around 2 a.m. Burn it too slow, and the house filled with so much smoke that your dreams had subtitles in Hobgoblin. Everyone smelled vaguely of smoked ham, whether they liked it or not. Then came the stove, cast iron, boxy, and frequently temperamental. It puffed along like a grumpy old man belching coal dust and heat in unpredictable intervals. Families would gather around it in the evenings, the children drifting off in a warm semicircle like mismatched socks beside a hearth. But the stove's heat traveled in a radius roughly equivalent to a polite cough. Sit too close, and you cooked like a Sunday roast. Sit too far, and you might as well be outside with the coyotes. To supplement the limited heat, pioneers turned to the humble bed warmer. This clever contraption consisted of a shallow metal pan filled with hot coals, slipped between the bed sheets in advance. Of course, this required a fine balance. Too few coals, and you were just pushing cold metal across cold linen. Too many, and you'd accidentally reinvent indoor wildfire. There are more than a few smoky stories buried in regional newspapers of the era. Homes saved, eyebrows not so lucky. For those really clawing after an edge, there were hot bricks wrapped in cloth, gently tucked at the foot of the bed. They held their warmth just long enough to lull your toes into betrayal before the creeping cold reclaimed its dominion. Children often fought, in a slow, exhausted way, over who got the slightly warmer side of the bed. The phrase, "don't hog the heat," might as well have been a frontier proverb. Insulation, such as it was, mostly came in the form of whatever a settler could stack, sew, nail, or stubbornly declare to be a wall. Scraps of cloth were hung over windows, which usually didn't fit their frames. Newspapers were pasted between logs for both insulation and bedtime reading. Yes, reading the walls was a thing. It saved paper and gave new life to last year's livestock reports. As for clothing, pioneers took the phrase "dress in layers" to an almost metaphysical level. Nightwear consisted of every woolen item a person owned. Mittens were sometimes worn in bed, so were hats and scarves, and reportedly a few sets of children. Families slept like haphazardly stacked laundry piles beneath towers of patched quilts and buffalo hides. If you could see your breath under the covers, well, at least you knew you were still breathing. Yet for all its discomfort, there's something strangely poetic about those nights. Huddled together for warmth, families told stories, some true, others suspiciously creative. Firelight flickered across log walls as wind howled like distant banshees, and in the background, the groan of snow settling on the roof, the metallic sigh of the stove cooling down, and maybe, just maybe, the soft creak of a rocking chair continuing its eternal conversation with the floor. As the prairie winds pick up again and a hush settles across the frostbitten plains, let us quietly unfold the next thread in this patchwork of pioneer survival. If you lived in a sod house on the frontier, you would eventually discover two enduring truths. First, that the walls sometimes grew grass, and second, that you had underestimated how many drafty holes could actually exist in a single dwelling. Most settlers came to this conclusion somewhere around the second week of winter, after they'd stuffed every corn husk, quilt scrap, and old pair of long johns into the gaps, and were still waking up with a thin veneer of frost on their eyebrows. By the time dust settled across the plains, the temperature often plummeted like a bison falling through a trapdoor. The wooden chinking in log cabins would creak with shrinking timber. Windows would rattle in poorly fitted frames, and frost would creep across the inside of the panes like a ghost refusing to pay rent. But amid the icy discomfort, there were tricks. Oh yes, there were tricks. Some practical, some desperate, and some downright audacious. One of the more curious defenses against the cold came in the form of the humble bed warmer. Picture this: a long-handled brass pan with a lid, often filled with glowing embers or hot stones, which settlers would slide between the sheets in a swan-like dance of not starting a fire in bed. It was a gamble, certainly, but one settlers were willing to make if it meant not waking up with feet shaped like hailstones. More commonly, though, they relied on the human furnace method. Pack everyone into the same bed, regardless of generational boundaries or social comfort. You, your spouse, your children, your aunt visiting from Missouri, and perhaps a border collie that didn't ask permission. Everyone huddled together under a limited supply of patchwork quilts, generating warmth with collective stubbornness. This snug arrangement often led to deep familial bonding, mild suffocation, and the early invention of turning over in unison. If you were lucky enough to have livestock, you probably also shared your sleeping quarters with them. With no central heating, a cow in the corner wasn't unpleasant company. It was a vital source of heat. Chickens under the bed clucked out gentle lullabies while emitting the ambient temperature of weak toast. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm-ish. During particularly brutal months, settlers took to sleeping underground, cellars, dugouts, or even crude earthen shelters covered in brush. These spaces, crude and damp though they were, held their heat better than a drafty shack. Occasionally, you'd wake up next to a curious mole or have a disagreement with a centipede, but warmth made strange bedfellows of everyone. Soup became less of a food group and more of a survival strategy. Meals in winter were structured events surrounding the largest heated thing in the house, whether it be a stove, a hearth, or a particularly irritable blacksmith if he was renting a room. Broth was heated and reheated, thickened into stews or poured into clay jars wrapped in cloth to act as rudimentary hot water bottles. There were reports of people lovingly naming these jars, talking to them during especially frigid nights. When your best friend is a jug of cabbage broth called Darlin, you've either gone mad or innovated the limits of homestead survival. And then there were the clothes. Oh, the clothes. Wool, flannel, hides. Layers upon more layers. The great onion strategy of personal climate control. By February, most settlers bore an uncanny resemblance to poorly stuffed pillows. Some were said to sleep in their coats, their hats, and, in one rather genuine case, their snowshoes. Just in case something went bump in the frosted void of midnight, and a quick escape required alpine agility. Despite all this, there was something profoundly human about the way settlers met such discomfort. With gritted teeth, chuckling resignation, and the occasional awkward family pile-on. They complained, of course. No one celebrates frostbite in verse. But they also sang songs, played fiddle tunes until their fingers numbed, and told stories by the firelight. Stories that stretched like taffy until they were more comforting than strictly accurate. No heat, no comfort, but a strange kind of closeness. The kind only 20 layers of homespun wool and a shared supper spoon could muster. And as the cold howled just beyond the tar paper walls, they somehow fell asleep, toasty from yesterday's soup and the day's light laughter, ready to meet another dawn of frost, chores, and the curious idea of starry perseverance. Now then, let's carefully tiptoe into a tale of smoke-stained ceilings, soot-smeared ingenuity, and the kindling of early American flue engineering. The frontier wind had no concept of manners. It didn't knock politely at the door before tumbling inside. No, it barreled through knotholes and ill-fitted hinges like an uninvited dinner guest who also happened to be made entirely of ice and regret. And yet, the settlers of the American West, those brave, chilly souls, found ways to survive the kind of cold that could reconfigure a man's opinion on everything, including whether westward expansion was really worth it. You might think that with all the hardships faced, rattlesnakes under floorboards, dust, storms, the occasional outlaw named Billy, they'd at least figure out central heating. But alas, their system of warmth was more of a patchwork quilt of questionable tactics, stubborn optimism, and a whole lot of animal fat, blubber, bacon grease, and good intentions. These were the unsung heroes of the winter months. Let's begin with the fireplace, the beating, somewhat feeble heart of any settler cabin. More smoke than flame, and more creaking wood than crackling joy. The average hearth was lovingly built from local stone and just vaguely effective. It could warm your front while your backside froze solid. Settlers developed a unique method of winter pacing. Stand near the fire until you began to sweat, then rotate to 180 degrees like a rotisserie chicken. Let the frostbite melt from the other side and repeat until spring. Fuel was whatever you could wrest from the land or your neighbor's woodpile under cover of darkness. Wood was admittedly the top choice, trees having the handy property of being both plentiful and flammable. But when the wood ran low, creativity stepped in the door, dusted snow from its boots, and got to work. It turns out that buffalo chips, a polite euphemism for dried dung, made excellent kindling. Light, compact, and surprisingly efficient, they allowed families to enjoy lovingly prepared meals with just the faintest aroma of prairie memories. It wasn't glamorous, certainly not fragrant, but it cooked your biscuits and softened your beans, and in the Old West, that was considered gourmet. Now, many of these rustic cabins were constructed with the same architectural rigor one applies to building a pillow fort, minus the luxury of softness or the thrilling possibility of toppling onto a sibling. Cracks between the logs were often wide enough to see the constellations without getting out of bed. To plug these gaps, settlers turned to a mixture of mud, straw, and whatever else could be shoved into a crevice and prayed into insulation. It was called chinking, and its ability to stop wind was roughly equivalent to that of a folded napkin. Those with more time and livestock on hand sometimes affixed hides to the log walls, a decorative motif best described as interior bison. Buffalo robes became the frontier's version of central heating, draped across beds, tacked to doors, lined along floors like vaguely haunted rugs. Nothing said cozy like sleeping beneath 200 pounds of hair and hide. The bedding situation, speaking of which, was an exercise in layering. Mattresses were usually burlap sacks stuffed with straw, hay, or if things were dire, corn cobs. On top came blankets made from wool, quilts sewn from memories and old trousers, and if fortune smiled, a buffalo robe or two. Not only did they keep the cold out, they also kept the sleeper firmly pinned to their mattress, unable to move and thus at near zero risk of unconsciously wandering into an icy demise. Children, of course, survived via time-honored tactics of communal huddling. Entire families would sleep like puppies in a basket, nestled against each other in a heap of elbows and dreams, a sort of human casserole. Personal space was a springtime concept, and while we like to think today that bedtime requires just the right ambience, a warm lamp, a gentle podcast, perhaps a lavender mist, the Wild West version involved lullabies sung through chattering teeth, the occasional mouse dropping from the rafters, and the relentless percussion of wind using the roof as a drum. Still, even amid the frostbite and fur bedding, there was something oddly poetic about life in a wintry cabin. There existed a rhythm. Boil the tea, bank the fire, patch the draft, cuddle the dog, and pray the snowstorm didn't bring the roof down. Survival wasn't just about strength. It was about stubbornness, creativity, and an intimate knowledge of how to stack bodies for warmth without offending Aunt Mabel. And as the wind whispered, across the plains and the stars blinked like distant campfires in the sky, life creaked along inside those humble log homes, resilient, resourceful, and wrapped in a quilt of buffalo and hope. Somehow they warmed their bones, and somehow they dreamed. Now let's draw the covers in closer and follow them into the next gentle memory, where warmth came not from heat, but from company, and something boiling in the iron kettle, out on the frigid plains, where the wind howled with the enthusiasm of a gossiping aunt. The homesteaders of the Wild West discovered that comfort wasn't something you waited for. It was something you cobbled together with bits of burlap, soup bones, and a suspiciously warm cow. Now, we've already warmed our way through makeshift masonry stoves and determined quilts, but tonight, let's tuck ourselves into the quiet miracle of the feather tick. Yes, the feather tick, a positively fluffy name for what was, in essence, the pioneers' answer to central heating. You see, before duvets became things you ordered with next-day delivery and argued about in IKEA showrooms, there were feather ticks, hand-sewn, down-stuffed, glorified sacks that settlers slept beneath like hibernating bears. Creating one was a labor of love, or, more honestly, a test of how many sacks of feathers you could stuff into a bed-sized fabric pocket before it became a budget hot air balloon. It was a layering strategy, a hug from the inside out. When winter truly bit through the walls, many a settler family would pile up 1, 2, even 3 feather ticks atop one mattress, which sounds plush until you realize that the sleeper on the bottom could barely breathe under the weight and had to inch out sideways like a letter under a door. These downy contraptions came with their own etiquette too. You never fluffed the tick too late in the day, not because of superstition, but because flailing arms full of feathers at midnight risked terrifying the livestock. And in households with several children, which is to say all of them, the feather tick might be shared communally across a sleeping platform wide enough to be a cafeteria table. If you were the lucky one assigned to the center, congratulations, your fellow siblings became your personal heating elements. If you were on the edges, well, hope your grandmother remembered the mutton fat foot warmers. But feather ticks weren't only for the body. Oh no, they were mental fortresses too. The feel of that heavy embrace, the rustle of time-softened fabric, the smell of woven wool and last summer's hay. It comforted in the way that no blizzard could breach. You didn't just sleep under a feather tick. You hid from February under it, with a wink and a muffled snore. Now, if by some twist of fate you couldn't manage a feather tick, maybe your geese went on strike, or your stuffing dreams were dashed by an unscrupulous trader, there were other options. Corn husk mattresses, woven rush pads, and even sacks loosely filled with straw. The problem? These things made noise. Slip onto a straw mattress the wrong way, and it sounded like you were falling into a pantry full of mice. Not ideal when someone in the next room was already threatening to shoot any future floorboard creaks. Some settlers got creative. One diary from 1883 recounts a Missouri mother who stitched together 14 rabbit pelts, 2 raccoons, and the lining of my uncle's smoking coat to create what she called a dream pad. It was, she admitted, not supple nor entirely hygienic, but did smell faintly of peppermint and goat, which we assume was a plus at the time. Interestingly, the feather tick era gave rise to a phenomenon I like to call pioneer pancaking. The nightly arrangement of bodies, blankets, and bulk, stacked for warmth like the world's least edible short stack. Siblings under the age of 7 often vanished entirely within the middle layers, only to be rediscovered in May. Family dogs occasionally snuck in, nestled under blankets, and re-emerged with a guilty tail wag and approximately 47 stolen crumbs. The feather tick wasn't just bedding, it was survival couture. It was domestic engineering. It was the single coziest thing you could own in a home made of logs, smoke, and prayers. And when nothing else stopped the wind but your own bones and some weather-beaten hope, well, a 2-quilt day became a full tick night. So tonight, as we let the last embers of the stove fade into soft red whispers, imagine the quiet rustle of feathers above, the creak of the bed frame below, and a long exhale of contentment rising like steam toward the barely insulated ceiling. It's almost time for dreams, But before we drift too far, let's take one last stop, where the world outside the walls was as chilling as the determination within. It's a quiet night, somewhere in the high plains of Wyoming territory where the stars blink like frozen lanterns and the wind hums lullabies through the gaps in every log wall. Inside a rickety sod house, the kind with more personality than insulation, a weary settler lies beneath a mishmash of patchwork quilts, flannel shirts, and no fewer than 3 hound dogs whose body heat has become less of a luxury and more of a household utility. Tonight's topic of contemplation, aside from the eternal mystery of how cold toast can be colder than ambient air, is a humble yet heroic device, the bed warmer. Yes, the unassuming pan on a stick, whose mission was to make frontier bedding less like an ice rink and more like slightly less of an ice rink. The bed warmer, for the uninitiated, was typically a long-handled brass or copper pan, sort of like an elegant frying pan, who grew up and got a real job. Settlers would fill it with hot coals from the evening fire, then carefully slide it between the bed sheets, moving it around to prevent scorching, and ideally, without lighting the whole bed ablaze. The line between cozy feet and a smouldering bedding disaster was, shall we say, a fine and sooty one. Those bed warmers weren't just utilitarian, they were romantic, in a flammable sort of way. Imagine, if you will, a pioneer courting ritual involving one party offering to warm the other's bedpan before sleep. In today's terms, that translates to a heartfelt text message saying, "I preheated your side of the bed." Same sentiment, fewer embers, but not everyone could afford brass pans or an extra chunk of coal. And so, our ever-resourceful ancestors relied on the age-old warmth of stones. Enter the soapstone. Heated in fires until it glowed shyly, it was wrapped in flannel, burlap, or anything that wasn't currently on fire, and gently placed at the foot of the bed. These stones held heat for hours, whispering nighttime warmth long after the hearth had gone dim. In the morning, settlers treated them like old friends, cool, dependable, and covered in a confusing amount of soot. Meanwhile, children often became unwitting heat sources themselves, packed into bed together like peas in a pleasantly chilled pod. It was not uncommon to find siblings arranged like seasoned firewood, eldest to youngest, insulating one another with the kind of closeness that only 19th century winters and one-bed households could inspire. Arguments about who got the warmest mittens by day gave way to silent treaties about toe placement by night. Even the most stoic frontierspeople weren't immune to a touch of bedtime superstition. In some homes, folks placed iron horseshoes near the hearth and then tucked them beneath the bed, both for warmth and supposed protection against ghosts, drafty spirits, or more plausibly, rats with attitude problems. Nothing says good night quite like a smouldering horseshoe under your straw tick mattress. Clothing, too, played an outsized nighttime role. Long johns were to 1800 settlers what fleece, pajama sets are to us today, except with more buttons, more wool, and, let's be honest, more unfortunate itchiness. Nightcaps, not the kind you sip, but the kind you tie under your chin, kept heads warm and hair from freezing to the pillow. Yes, that was a possibility. When your breath turns to frost and your pillow crunches, you start innovating, or shopping for a bigger nightcap. Of course, not everyone agreed on bedtime routines. Some self-proclaimed tough types, grizzled ranchers, lonesome cowboys with names like Slim or Toothless Bill, scoffed at bed warmers, favoring a bracing plunge into icy sheets as a character-building exercise. It's unclear how much character was built this way, or whether such characters eventually thawed, but the stories live on, frosty and slightly exaggerative. Naturally, the animals had their own solutions. Barn cats curled into hay bales, hens fluffed their feathers like Victorian skirts, and horses huddled flank to flank in steamy companionship. Dogs, having long declared themselves essential heating elements, proudly snored at their post-by blanket. So, under soot-smeared stones and lovingly scorched linens, beneath roofs that creaked in the cold and walls stitched together with frost and hope, settlers dreamed, not always of springtime or modern insulation, but sometimes just of socks that didn't freeze into fashionable U-shapes overnight. The night grows deeper now, quiet as snowfall on buffalo grass. And as our frontier sleepers drift off, perhaps it's time to tiptoe even further into these winter traditions, where comfort was made, not bought, and warmth came from every ember, stone, and snoring dog in reach. And then there were potatoes. Yes, the humble potato, starchy, unassuming, and oddly heroic in the frozen wilderness of the American frontier. While legends often sing the praises of six-shooters, wagon grease, and the iron nerves of the early settlers, very few ballads have been written about root vegetables bravely withstanding the winter. But perhaps they should be, because tucked into root cellars and buried beneath sawdust and straw, the potato became a quiet savior during the West's colder spells. As snow pressed up against windows and the night howled like a bored wolf, settlers turned to their pantries with the solemn ceremony of a chapel procession. Potatoes were boiled, roasted, mashed, and, when the winter dragged on longer than patience, sometimes just plunked into the ashes of a dying fire and eaten with fingers sticky from soot. But the potato was more than just a belly warmer. In some homesteads, hot potatoes were passed from hand to hand like toasty torches, offering comfort before farm folk scuttled off to bed. Children nestled under quilts with a steaming potato in each mitt, cradling them like soft, edible sleeping bags for their fingers. In particularly frigid rooms, a basket of baked potatoes might even be placed beneath bedclothes like a primitive, electric blanket, which, as it turns out, required a lot less power and a lot more butter. And yet, the great potato pillow wasn't the only bedtime innovation settlers devised to keep Jack Frost from nibbling their extremities. Let us speak now, in whispers, of the bed warmer, a noble object if there ever was one, fashioned in brass or tin, filled with embers and slid with stealth and reverence between damp sheets. Like the guest invited before the dinner party starts, it prepared the way for human occupants. Though it bore a slight risk of fire and the occasional undercarriage singeing, bed warmers were otherwise considered marvels of nocturnal luxury. One could almost hear the sighs of relief echo across the prairie when a thoroughly roasted foot met a slightly less frigid mattress. Of course, not every settler had the luxury of potatoes or copper gadgets shaped like oversized ladles. Some turned to what was always available, each other. Communal sleeping arrangements were the original answer to heating shortages. Entire families, sometimes along with a dog, 2 cats, and occasionally a confused chicken, would pile into one bed like a lumpy lasagna of wool and humanity. In log cabins, where the wind found its way through every careless chink in the wall, nobody declined an extra pair of feet to warm their own. Children often slept sideways across the bottom of the bed, what some refer to as the foot situation, while parents claimed the upper region, presumably because they earned the spot by doing things like building the house and not falling into wells. Even neighbors might bunk together during travel or emergency. Hospitality had practical temperature benefits, and guests were rarely turned away in winter, not just out of kindness, but also because more bodies meant less frostbite. Clothing also took on nocturnal duties. In summer, a wool shirt was an itchy obedience test. In winter, it became treasured armor. Many settlers didn't undress to sleep so much as merely loosen the parts of their outfit that prohibited breathing. Entire wardrobes, hats included, would remain intact through the night. Some slept with their boots still on, not so much from fashion, but because removing them felt like an act that might never be reversed if the room dropped another 10 degrees. And speaking of boots, emptied footwear served as makeshift hot water bottles if a person had the rare luxury of warm water. Socks, if rotated daily and not yet transformed into icy boards, were layered upon hands, heads, and sometimes over ears in makeshift attempts at earmuffs. It was a time when the technology of comfort boiled down to intuition, improvisation, and the excellent heat-retaining properties of a round carbohydrate. Suffering shared was suffering softened, and the settlers became masters of making do, with what they grew, what they built, and sometimes what they cuddled. But even with baked potatoes and foot-warming chickens, some nights brought such stubborn cold that only one thing could truly help: good old-fashioned stubbornness. And that, perhaps, is what will gently unfold next, when even the fires burn low and the moon casts its still silver over a dozen sleeping roofs. A deeper kind of warmth must be summoned from within. Somewhere in the middle of a moonlit prairie, where the frost holds hands with the grass and coyotes sing their feelings at inconvenient hours, a family of Wild West settlers once argued quietly over the ethics of sleeping with their boots on. Not because it was particularly comfortable. Oh no, boots then were roughly the consistency of a wooden salad bowl, but because they were warm, and because nobody quite trusted the neighbor's dog not to make off with them during the night. You see, bitter nighttime cold wasn't just a nuisance, it was a menace, the kind that crept under doors, sneaked through knotholes in walls, and slipped beneath blankets to nibble at one's toes, like a malicious ghost with a foot fetish. Staying warm wasn't a convenience, it was a team sport, a science, an art, and occasionally an accident. Winter plans began in summer. Pioneers seemed relaxed, whittling under the sun, but they were also thinking, is there enough buffalo dung out back to heat the cabin come December? Because wood, sacred wood, wasn't always easy to come by unless you happened to live near a forest or had a very giving neighbor with a loose moral code. So they got creative. When firewood was scarce, anything flammable was fair game. Corn cobs, twigs, cow pies. One enterprising fellow from Dakota Territory once claimed to keep warm by burning old Sears Roebuck catalogs, though this inadvertently led to both warmth and orthopedic eye strain. But the pioneering people weren't just fire-hungry pyros stuffing chimneys with anything that smoldered. They also used architecture to their frosty advantage. Cabins were built low and tight, their roofs often pitched at just the right angle to shrug off snow but trap heat like an anxious hen. Doors opened inward, not due to any decor trend, but because snowdrifts liked pranking people by piling high outside. And windows, if they had any, the lucky ones stuffed them with oiled paper or animal gut to block the wind, but still let in a reluctant beam or two of light. Inside, the heating methods could be best described as rustically enthusiastic. The central character in any cozy cabin drama was the cast iron stove. These mighty contraptions were often named Bertha, Old Scorchy, or That Infernal Heap, and were known to run painfully hot or mockingly cold, rarely in between. If you fell asleep too close, You might wake up the next day with a slightly toasted elbow, too far, and you spent the night negotiating with your own breath, which had inconveniently turned into icicles. At night, folks piled on the bedclothes. The higher the mound, the warmer the dreams. Blankets were layered, borrowed, stolen, or woven from scratch. Quilting bees doubled as social events and survival investments. A typical prairie bed might hold 3 quilts, a buffalo robe, 1 errant cat, and the better part of your in-laws. And then, of course, came the hot bricks. Gloriously simple. A brick, heated on the stove, wrapped in cloth, and slipped into bed like a foot-sized angel of warmth. Copper kettles filled with water did the job too. The brave ones attempted hot potato sacks, though these had a frustrating habit of cooling rapidly or leaking in the night and adding a splash of regret to an already difficult situation. Clothing decisions became chess matches. You wanted to warm up at night, but you also didn't want to wake up tangled in a girdle or slowly freezing inside a fully buttoned day coat. So compromises were made. Long johns, flatteringly called union suits, were rarely removed in winter, which made their flap in the back function both logical and suspiciously celebrated. If you were terribly refined, perhaps you even aired your long johns by the stove before climbing in, pretending for one fleeting moment that you had full control over your life. Families kept close, and not entirely by choice. Children were often bundled 2 or 3 to a bed, partly to save space, partly to save lives, and partly because their relative size allowed for easier repositioning, like logs in a cordwood stack. A typical winter night began with laughter, pillow fights, and forced harmonies of offbeat hymn singing, and ended with a petition to be allowed to sleep facing away from Cousin Albert's elbows. And when all else failed, hardy pioneers turned to shared storytelling, whispered fables, tales half remembered from the old country, or entirely invented 10 minutes prior. These were precious moments, when breath fogged in the firelight and time slowed down long enough to believe they'd make it through the winter after all. Now let us gently button the memory of those smoky cabins, where warmth was a manual labor act and bedtime stories came stitched between quilt corners, and prepare ourselves to drift even deeper, where the final thoughts of cold nights surrender softly to dreams. In the final hush of the wild frontier night, the fire has long since given its last crackle. The stars, those glittering pinholes in the thick tarp of prairie dark, begin to dim as if dozing themselves. Inside the tiny log cabin, with its frostbitten corners sealed by old newspaper clippings and good intentions, the true marvel of settler ingenuity reveals itself not in hardship, but in hush. By now, every soul under the roof is snug, layered in wool, encased in quilts that smell faintly of wood smoke and generations past. That curious bump under the blanket near the hearth, likely a dog, or a cat, or if they were desperate enough, a chicken in a bonnet. All were welcome, as long as they breathed warm air and didn't snore, louder than Grandpa. It was here, in this silence, a silence so deep you could hear snowflakes whisper on the windows, that a strange kind of peace took root. Because you see, surviving the cold wasn't just about not freezing to death. It was about rearranging the soul to tolerate discomfort with a quiet nobility. It meant looking winter in the eye and declaring, without flinching, "Fine, I'll put on another pair of socks made from Aunt Mabel's old shawl." But even in these conditions, humans did what humans do best: adapt creatively and complain just enough to feel better. Take the widespread art of bed sharing, for instance. Entire families, from the crankiest grandmother to the gassiest toddler, Crammed into one straw-stuffed bed under so many blankets, it took a team effort just to roll over. The laws of Newton were tested each time someone turned, every movement requiring a counterbalance. If one person shifted, the others followed, as if caught in a slow-motion human ripple. Comfort? Questionable. Warmth? Absolutely. Personal space? A myth. Some nights, it wasn't the wind that kept settlers awake, but the slow, steady marching of bedbugs, those six-legged winter companions who didn't care about your hardship. And lice. Oh yes. When you couldn't wash for weeks and wore your union suit until spring. Your scalp practically became its own homesteader settlement. Still, they endured. Because just knowing how to stay warm was its own kind of power. A quiet, stubborn knowledge passed down through whispered tricks and steaming mugs. Hollowed bricks, heated in the fire and wrapped in flannel, made for surprisingly efficient foot warmers. Ovens, once dinner was done, served dual purposes, converted into makeshift saunas for thawing numb fingers and cold leftovers. Some folks even warmed up their underclothes by draping them over the stovepipe, provided they didn't forget and create a flannel inferno. Laundry day memories were forged in those moments, quite literally. And all the while, the prairie slept too, stretched wide and frozen, its lonely beauty humming just beneath the snow. Coyotes sang lullabies no one asked for. The wind whipped around corners like a moody theatre critic. But within walls of hewn logs, the settler family endured in a cocoon of resilience, exhaustion, and a staggering amount of beaver pelts sewn into coats. As spring tiptoed toward them, nothing dramatic, just a faint warmth in the breeze and icicles dripping like leaky faucets. The challenges of the cold began to fade into proud stories. Stories that would be repeated year after year, usually with a few extra inches of snow and fewer working toes than the version before. They made it through winters with nothing but wit and wool, some great-grandchild would one day say, bundled in a heated jacket, sipping artisanal cocoa, and Googling how to remove a hangnail. And though it sounds comical, the spirit of those frostbitten forebearers would live right there, in that stubborn desire not just to survive, but to sip something warm while doing it. Cold was never the enemy. It was the quiet teacher, the slow sculptor of character. It chiseled humility, hardened empathy, and ensured you'd never again take a warm biscuit for granted. And now, as your own night deepens and your breath slows, let those old snow-covered cabins settle in your mind like flakes on pine. Let the scratchy quilts and sleepy chickens wander softly through your dreams. Their world, impossibly cold, undeniably brave, rest gently over yours, like a flannel gently folded by time. Good night, little pioneer. It's warm enough now. You made it through the winter.